Dorothy Walker stood beside her husband's casket and counted. 312 people filed past each one, delivering condolences that blurred together like equations she'd stopped trying to solve. Her feet ached in shoes she'd bought specifically for this occasion, black pumps that pinched at the heel. Stephen had been dead for 6 days, and already her brain was doing what it always did, calculating, measuring, quantifying the grief she was supposed to feel, but couldn't quite access through the mathematics. 53 years of marriage reduced to a Tuesday in October. She'd found him in his recliner, the television still broadcasting the morning news, his coffee cup resting on the side table with exactly half the contents remaining. The paramedic said his heart simply stopped the way hearts do when they've carried the weight of building an insurance empire from nothing for 3.5 decades. Dorothy could have told them his heart had been failing for years. She'd watched the color drain from his face in increments she could measure, watched him stop climbing stairs after the first mild attack in 2019, watched him surrender the pretense that everything was fine sometime around the beginning of last year. The funeral was tasteful. Kenneth made certain of that. Her son stood at 47 years old in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Dorothy had spent on clothing in the past 5 years, combined, shaking hands with every attendee, deploying the perfect blend of grief and composure. Rebecca hovered beside him in black silk and pearls, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she'd been holding for the better part of an hour. Dorothy's daughter had always been good at performing emotion without actually feeling it, a skill Dorothy recognized because she'd spent most of her adult life doing the same thing. The reception after the burial lasted exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. Dorothy knew because she checked her watch when the first guest arrived, and again when the last one departed. Kenneth's wife Heather managed the catering with military precision, ensuring everyone had enough food and drink while simultaneously making it clear through tight smiles and clipped responses that she was deeply inconvenienced by the whole affair. The grandchildren, Nicole, 16, and wearing headphones even at her grandfather's funeral, sat in a corner, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up when someone spoke to her directly. Dorothy went home to the house she'd shared with Stephen for 32 years and sat in the silence. The mortgage had been paid off in 2011. The furniture was the same set they'd purchased in 1989. Everything was familiar, and nothing felt like home anymore. She made tea she didn't drink and wondered if this hollowness in her chest was grief or simply the absence of routine. 14 days later, Kenneth called a family meeting. He used those exact words on the phone, his voice carrying the same tone he probably used with clients at Walker and Associates. Dorothy drove to his house, the one she and Stephen had provided the $80,000 down payment for 15 years ago, and parked in the circular driveway that had always struck her as excessive for a 4-bedroom colonial. Inside, Kenneth and Rebecca sat at the dining room table with papers spread between them like evidence at a trial. Kenneth cleared his throat, a habit he'd inherited from Stephen. Dorothy sat across from her children and folded her hands, waiting. The meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes. She knew because she counted every one of them. We need to discuss Dad's estate. The house, Kenneth explained, had Stephen's name and his own on the deed. A decision made 12 years ago after Stephen's first serious heart episode, purely practical, nothing personal. Dorothy remembered the conversation vaguely, something about estate planning and tax benefits that had seemed reasonable at the time. Now, sitting in this dining room that smelled of Heather's expensive candles, The practicality revealed itself for what it truly was. "Technically, the house is mine," Kenneth said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm not trying to kick you out, Mom, but Heather and I have been thinking about the space. The kids are getting bigger, and there's the question of maintenance, property taxes, upkeep. It's a lot for you to manage alone." Dorothy looked at her son. She'd taught 7th grade mathematics for 35 years before retiring, had spent 3.5 decades watching children lie with more honesty than this. Kenneth wanted the house. The rest was just arithmetic to make the equation balance in his favor. "You want me to leave. We want you to transition." Rebecca found a nice assisted living community in "I'm 70 Kenneth, not 85. Rebecca leaned forward, deploying the same sympathetic expression she probably used with difficult clients in her interior design business. Dorothy had always wondered how Rebecca could make a living telling other people how to arrange their furniture when her own life seemed perpetually cluttered with poor decisions and expensive mistakes. "Nobody's saying you can't take care of yourself, Mom. We just think it would be easier, safer, and there's the matter of the accounts, the bank accounts." Dorothy listened as her children explained how they'd moved the funds, every dollar she and Stephen had saved over 53 years of marriage, into a trust for estate management purposes. They were co-trustees naturally, for her protection, to make things simpler, to ensure proper handling during this difficult transition. "You emptied the accounts," Dorothy said, her voice flat. "We secured the accounts," Kenneth corrected. "There's a difference." Dorothy had spent her entire career teaching children how to identify patterns in numbers. She could see this pattern clearly. Her children had taken her house, her money, and her agency, all while maintaining expressions of deep concern for her well-being. The mathematics of betrayal were remarkably simple once you stripped away the emotional variables. "And the car?" Rebecca shifted in her seat. "I'm going to take it. You don't drive much anymore, Mom. It just sits in the garage. We'll arrange transportation for you." "There are services." Dorothy looked at her daughter. Rebecca had Stephen's jaw and Dorothy's eyes, though she'd apparently inherited none of Dorothy's ability to calculate the long-term consequences of short-term decisions. The car wasn't about transportation. It was about independence, about the ability to leave when she wanted go, where she needed exist, without requiring permission or assistance from her own children. "Is there anything left?" Kenneth and Rebecca exchanged the kind of look that siblings share when they think they're being subtle. Rebecca almost laughed when she spoke, the sound catching in her throat like a hiccup. "There's Grandpa Donald's farm, the one in Tennessee. Dad always said it was worthless. The county sent letters about back taxes a few years ago, about $11,000. The property's assessed at less than what's owed. Nobody would buy it even if we wanted to sell." Dorothy sat very still. Her father's farm, the place she'd visited maybe a dozen times as a child, a crumbling house and a barn her father had kept locked for reasons he never explained. Donald Harris had died 22 years ago, leaving her that property in a trust she'd barely thought about since Stephen had filed the paperwork away in whatever cabinet he'd deemed appropriate. "I'll take it." Kenneth blinked, his expression shifting from practiced sympathy to genuine confusion. "Take what?" "The farm. I'll take the farm." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, and now the laugh did escape, sharp and disbelieving. "Mom, there's nothing there. The house is probably condemned by now. County threatened to bulldoze it 3 years ago. There's no water, no electricity, no—" "You said it's mine. My father left it to me. Not to a trust you control, not to you, to me." Kenneth's jaw tightened. It's worthless, Mom. You'd be taking on debt just to own a pile of rotting wood in the middle of nowhere. Then you won't mind if I keep it. Neither of them argued further. Why would they? They'd gotten everything that mattered, the house worth $485,000. According to the most recent assessment, the bank accounts totaling $127,000, the car, the insurance business that Stephen had built from nothing. The farm represented nothing but liability, a financial black hole that would cost $11,000 just to bring current on taxes. Dorothy left Kenneth's house that evening with her purse, her coat, and the pocket watch her father had pressed into her hand during her last visit to the farm when she was 48 and he was dying of emphysema. The watch was brass-heavy with 4 numbers engraved on the back that she'd always assumed represented something important, but had never quite deciphered. Donald had looked at her with eyes clouded by medication and decades of secrets, and said only this, "Keep it. You'll know when you need it." 22 years later, sitting in Kenneth's guest bedroom that smelled of Heather's lavender room spray and accumulated resentment, Dorothy pulled out the watch and examined those numbers again. Not a date, not a combination, just 4 digits that meant nothing and everything. She stayed in that guest bedroom for 3 weeks. Kenneth and Heather made their feelings known through 1,000 small gestures, the way Heather sighed when Dorothy used the kitchen, the way the grandchildren were told to keep quiet, because Grandma needed rest, which really meant Grandma was in the way. Kenneth left brochures for assisted living facilities on her nightstand. Sunrise Gardens, peaceful meadows, places with names designed to make you forget you were being warehoused until death. On the 22nd day, Dorothy packed her suitcase. 1 suitcase. Everything she owned fit inside it with room to spare. At the bottom, beneath her clothes and toiletries, she placed an old notebook she'd found in the back of Kenneth's guest closet. Her own notebook from graduate school, filled with calculations and proofs from a mathematics degree she'd started at MIT before meeting Stephen and making different choices. She'd forgotten she'd left it here years ago during some visit she could no longer clearly remember. The Greyhound bus ticket from Columbus to Hartsville, Tennessee, cost $37. Dorothy sat by the window and watched Ohio transform into Kentucky, then Tennessee flat suburbs giving way to rolling hills and bare trees that looked like equations waiting to be solved. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying in Kenneth's guest bedroom at 3 a.m. when she could muffle the sound with pillows. That particular variable had been solved and set aside. Hartsville wasn't much 2 blocks of Main Street, a hardware store called Patterson's, a diner, a post office, and a church whose sign advertised services every Sunday and Wednesday evening. The bus dropped her at a gas station on the edge of town where a teenage attendant looked at her like she'd materialized from another dimension. Dorothy asked for directions to the old Harris farm. The kid scratched his chin and pointed east. "About 4 miles out on County Road 12. Nobody's been there in years, ma'am." "You family?" "I'm his daughter." Didn't know Mr. Harris had any family. He kept to himself. Dorothy walked 4 miles in 2 hours, her suitcase bumping against her leg with every step. A truck slowed as it passed the driver, a heavy-set woman in a feed cap rolling down her window. "You need a ride, hun." "I'm almost there." "Where's there?" "The Harris farm." The woman's eyebrows rose. "That old place?" "You sure?" Dorothy nodded. The woman shrugged and drove on, leaving Dorothy alone with the sound of her own footsteps and the calculation forming in her mind. 4 miles, 2 hours average speed of 2 miles per hour, which meant she was walking at approximately half the pace of a normal adult, which meant she was either exhausted or terrified, or both. The farm emerged from the landscape like a wound that had never quite healed. The driveway was barely visible, choked with weeds and saplings that had pushed through gravel over 2 decades of neglect. The house sat at the end of it, a 2-story structure that had once been white but now showed more bare wood than paint. One upstairs window was broken. The porch sagged on the left side where the supports had rotted through. Behind the house stood the barn, red once now, weathered to gray. The roof had partially collapsed on the south end, but the main structure remained intact. A padlock hung on the door, rusted but still secure after all these years. Dorothy stood at the end of the driveway and did the mathematics. $11,000 in debt, a house that might not survive winter, a barn her father had kept, locked her entire life, and $52 in her wallet. The equation didn't balance. It couldn't balance. And yet, here she was, because sometimes the only solution to an impossible problem was to redefine the variables. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the front door. It wasn't locked. It had never been locked. Donald Harris had never locked the house. Only the barn. Inside, dust covered everything, like a theorem proving the passage of time. The air tasted stale, trapped. Dorothy set her suitcase in the front hallway and walked through rooms that smelled of abandonment and her father's pipe tobacco, a scent that shouldn't have lingered this long, but somehow had. The kitchen still had dishes in the cabinets, plates with a blue flower pattern she remembered from childhood. The living room contained her father's leather recliner positioned near the window with a perfect view of the barn. Dorothy found the breaker box and flipped the main switch. Nothing happened. She tried the kitchen faucet. Dry. She sat in her father's chair and looked out at the barn, calculating the probability that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. The number kept coming up higher than she wanted to acknowledge. That first night, she slept on a bare mattress in her father's bedroom, covered by a quilt her mother had made before Dorothy was born. The stitching was coming apart in places, but it held warmth. She woke at dawn to the sound of birds, actual birds, close and loud, not the muffled urban sounds she'd lived with for decades, and lay there listening to them solve the problem of mourning in a way mathematics never could. She spent 3 days cleaning, working through the house room by room, sweeping floors and wiping surfaces and scraping mold from bathroom tiles with a butter knife because she couldn't afford proper supplies. On the second day, a neighbor a half-mile down the road saw her hauling debris to a burn pile and drove over in a mud-splattered pickup. "You living here?" "I am. Water's been shut off. You'll need to call the county to get it turned back on. Electric, too. How much will that cost?" "Couple hundred for the deposits, probably." Dorothy thanked him. She had $52. 200 was a wall she couldn't climb. But the next morning, she found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address. Inside, $300 in $20 bills and a note in shaky handwriting. "Donald was a good neighbor when my husband got hurt in the mine accident back in '62. We never forgot. Hardware store will bill me for whatever you need." A friend. Dorothy stood at the mailbox, holding the money and the note, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt something other than calculation. She didn't know who had sent it. She didn't ask. She simply accepted that some equations balanced in ways that had nothing to do with numbers. She called the county from the neighbor's phone and arranged for water and electricity to be restored. By the end of the first week, the house was livable. Not comfortable, not pretty, but functional. The water ran brown for the first 20 minutes, then cleared. The electricity worked in every room except the upstairs bathroom, where the wiring had apparently given up sometime in the previous decade. Dorothy cooked her first meal on the old gas stove, beans and rice with salt, and a can of tomatoes she bought at Patterson's Hardware, which also sold a limited selection of groceries. She ate at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the barn, and thought about the mathematics of her father's life. Donald Harris had been, according to every story she'd ever heard, a simple farmer, a quiet man who worked his land and kept to himself and died with almost nothing to his name. But Dorothy had found things in his closet that first week of cleaning a degree from Colorado School of Mines, dated 1947, employment records from the Tennessee Valley Authority Geological Survey maps of Harris County, with handwritten annotations in her father's precise engineering script. Her father hadn't been a farmer. He'd been a mining engineer who'd chosen, for reasons he'd never explained, to bury his expertise under the guise of rural simplicity. Dorothy spread the geological maps on the kitchen table and studied them. The barn location was marked with a notation: limestone bedrock, 12 feet depth, natural aquifer 40 feet, temperature constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. These weren't a farmer's notes. These were the calculations of someone who understood geology, who knew how to identify optimal conditions for something that required temperature stability and structural integrity. Dorothy measured the barn's dimensions from the property survey: 40 feet by 60 feet, too precise to be accidental. The symmetry bothered her in the way mathematical problems always bothered her until she solved them. On the 8th day, a truck pulled up at 6:45 in the morning. A man climbed out, tall, late 60s, with calloused hands and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. He introduced himself as Gary Patterson, cousin to Tom, who ran the hardware store, and explained that he'd heard she might need help with the barn. Dorothy stood on the porch in her father's old work jacket and studied this stranger. Why would you help someone you don't know? Because your father hired me as an apprentice electrician in 1975, taught me the trade when nobody else would take a chance on a kid from the wrong side of town. I owe him. What did he pay you? $3.50 an hour, above minimum wage back then, and he never once asked why I needed the money, even though he probably knew my wife was sick and medical bills were burying us. Dorothy nodded slowly. Let me make coffee. They sat on the porch with cups of percolator coffee that was probably too strong, but neither of them complained. The morning was cold, the sky pale gray, and the fields around the farm stretched empty in every direction. Gary explained that he'd worked with Donald on various electrical projects over the years, had even helped rewire part of the barn back in the mid-70s, though Donald had been particular about which sections Gary was allowed to touch. He was protecting something, Dorothy said. That was my impression. Never asked what. Your father was the kind of man who kept his business to himself, and I respected that. They walked to the barn together. Dorothy had been circling it all week, studying it from different angles, measuring it with her eyes and her steps. The padlock that had hung on the door for 2 decades came off easily when Gary applied bolt cutters, the hasp pulled free from rotted wood with barely any resistance. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and abandonment. Collapsed beams from the partial roof cave-in lay tangled on the south side. Tools hung on walls, so rusted they'd become sculpture. A workbench sat against the far wall, its surface buried under debris. Dorothy stepped carefully across the floor, testing each footfall. The floor felt solid, too solid. She kicked aside some of the ancient hay near the entrance and looked down. Concrete, smooth poured concrete extending from wall to wall across the entire barn floor. Barns didn't have poured concrete floors. They had dirt or packed earth, or sometimes wooden planks. Concrete was expensive, required professional work, served a purpose beyond simple agriculture. Dorothy walked the entire floor, kicking hay aside as she went. The concrete was consistent, professional, clearly done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Near the northeast corner, she noticed the surface was slightly different. Smoother, newer perhaps, though still decades old. She stomped on it. The sound changed hollow instead of solid, with an echo that suggested empty space below. Gary joined her, kneeling to knock on the concrete with his knuckles. The hollow sound resonated back deep and clear. "There's something under here," he said. "A void, maybe 8 to 10 feet down, based on the resonance." Dorothy pulled out the pocket watch her father had given her 22 years ago. She turned it over, examining the 4 numbers engraved on the back. But they weren't numbers, she realized now. They were coordinates, 35 degrees, 47 minutes, and 86 degrees, 23 minutes latitude and longitude markers for this exact location. Her father hadn't left her a combination. He'd left her a map, a precise engineering notation telling her exactly where to dig. "We need to break through this concrete," Dorothy said. Gary studied her for a moment. "That's a lot of jackhammer work for a woman your age." "Then it's fortunate I'm not planning to do it myself." He almost smiled. "I've got equipment in my truck, but Dorothy, if we find something down there, something your father went to this much trouble to hide, you need to be prepared for what that might mean." Dorothy looked at the barn floor, at the concrete her father had poured with such precision, at the locked door he'd maintained for decades. She thought about the geological surveys in his closet, the mining engineering degree, the careful calculations that had defined his entire approach to this property. "I'm a mathematician," she said quietly. "I've spent my whole life preparing for variables I couldn't predict." Gary set up his compressor outside the barn door and ran the hose to his jackhammer. The noise when he started was tremendous, echoing off the barn walls and shaking the tools on their hooks. Dorothy tied a cloth over her nose and mouth against the dust and watched as Gary drove the chisel point into the concrete near the northeast corner. Chunks flew, dust filled the air until Dorothy could barely see. Gary worked methodically, breaking a 3-foot square area, peeling away layers of concrete that crumbled into rubble. 40 minutes later, the chisel hit something different. Metal. The clang rang through the barn, sharp and unmistakable above the jackhammer's roar. Gary killed the compressor. The silence felt enormous. He knelt and brushed away concrete debris with his hands. Dorothy moved closer. Beneath the broken concrete, dull gray steel glinted in the light, filtering through the barn's gaps and broken roof. Gary cleared more debris, widening the hole until the full outline became visible. A hatch, 4 feet square, 3/4-inch steel plate, precisely fabricated, set into a steel frame that had been bolted to a concrete foundation beneath the barn floor. Military-grade construction, professional installation, and securing it all, a heavy-duty combination lock that looked newer than the rest of the installation, as if it had been replaced or maintained over the years. Gary sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Your father didn't just hide something, Dorothy. He engineered a vault." Dorothy knelt beside the hatch. She ran her fingers across the steel, feeling the precision of the welding, the careful attention to every detail. This wasn't the work of a simple farmer. This was the work of someone trained to build things that would last, who understood load-bearing calculations and temperature control, and the exact specifications required to create an underground chamber that could survive decades without maintenance. She pulled out the pocket watch again, but the coordinates on the back had already served their purpose. She needed the combination now. 4 numbers. She tried her father's birth year, 1925. Nothing. His death year, 2003. Nothing. Her birth year, 1952. The lock didn't budge. Gary watched silently, giving her space to work through the problem. Dorothy closed her eyes and thought about her father, about the man who'd earned a mining engineering degree in 1947, who'd worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority, who'd chosen to bury all that expertise under the identity of a rural farmer. What would matter most to him? What 4 numbers would he consider significant enough to protect whatever he'd hidden beneath this barn? 1947. The year he graduated from Colorado School of Mines. The year he became an engineer. She dialed the combination lock, left to 1 right, to 9 left, to 4 right, to 7. The lock clicked open in her hands. Dorothy's hands were shaking now. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she gripped the lock, felt the weight of all those years of secrecy and protection and careful planning. Gary moved to help her lift the hatch, and together they swung it back on hinges that groaned from decades of disuse. Cool air rose from the opening, carrying a smell she didn't immediately recognize, something sweet and sharp and chemical all at once mixed with the scent of oak and age. Below them, a steel ladder descended into darkness. Gary reached for his flashlight. "I'll go first." "No." Dorothy's voice was firm. "This is my father's. Whatever's down there, he left it for me. I go first." She gripped the top rung of the ladder and lowered herself into the opening. The rungs were solid, bolted to the wall, with the same engineering precision as everything else. She counted as she descended 8 rungs, approximately 10 feet down, exactly the depth her father's geological survey had marked as optimal for reaching the limestone bedrock. Her feet touched a concrete floor. She turned on her LED lantern and swept the beam across the darkness, and then stopped breathing entirely. The vault was enormous. It stretched the full length and width of the barn, above approximately 35 by 55 feet, based on her mental calculations, slightly smaller than the barn's footprint, to allow for support walls. The ceiling was 8 feet high, reinforced with steel beams. The air was cool and dry, maintained at a constant temperature by a ventilation system she could hear humming faintly in the walls, and filling every inch of available space, wooden shelving units, hundreds of them, floor to ceiling, each one loaded with glass bottles sealed with wax, each bottle bearing a handwritten label. Dorothy walked forward slowly, her lantern beam cutting through the darkness. She pulled a bottle from the nearest shelf. The glass was thick, the wax seal unbroken. The label, written in her father's careful script, read, "Harris Reserve, 1951, Barrel 7, Bottle 43. She held it up to the light. The liquid inside was the color of dark amber, perfectly clear. Whiskey. Her father had been making whiskey. Gary climbed down behind her, his flashlight joining hers. They stood side by side in the middle of a room that shouldn't exist, surrounded by thousands of bottles that represented decades of secret production and careful storage. Dorothy began to count, not randomly, but systematically, walking each shelf and recording numbers in the notebook she'd brought from her father's house. 1951, vintage 287 bottles. 1952, 312 bottles. The numbers continued through the years, averaging around 400 bottles annually from 1953 through 1960, then dropping to approximately 300 bottles per year from 1961 through 1967. When she finished counting, she sat on a stool at the workbench near the ladder and pulled out the calculator watch Stephen had given her for their 30th anniversary. Average age of bottles 58 years. Conservative estimate of current market value based on vintage bourbon appreciation rates she'd researched at the library. $4,500 per bottle on the low end. Total collection value, approximately $23.6 million. Dorothy wrote the number in her notebook and stared at it. Her children had taken her house, her car, her bank accounts. They'd left her with what they thought was worthless, a rotting farm with $11,000 in debt. They'd left her with the one thing that mattered, and they'd been too focused on immediate assets to see it. She looked around the vault again, at the shelving her father had built, at the bottles he'd sealed and stored with such care, at the engineering precision that had gone into creating a space that could preserve whiskey for more than half a century. This wasn't just money. This was proof that her father had spent his entire adult life building something specifically for her, protecting it with every skill he possessed, waiting for the moment when she would need it most. Gary cleared his throat softly. "What are you going to do?" Dorothy stood and walked to the workbench. Beneath a heavy glass bottle, serving as a paperweight, she found an envelope. Yellowed paper, but intact. Her name written on the front in her father's handwriting. She broke the wax seal and pulled out the letter, and began to read by the light of her lantern while Gary stood at a respectful distance, giving her whatever privacy an underground vault could offer. The letter began simply, "Dorothy, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I owe you the truth about why I was never the father you deserved." Dorothy read about how Donald Harris had started making whiskey in 1949, fresh from the war, and unable to feed his pregnant wife on what the farm could earn. She read about his skill, his success, the money that had flowed in from buyers who came from Louisville and Lexington and Nashville for bourbon that was clean and smooth and aged to perfection. She read about how he'd built this vault in 1953, digging it by hand, every shovel of clay and bucket of dirt, because he needed a room nobody knew about to store what he was creating. The letter explained 18 years of production of barrel aging in white oak, of careful bottling and sealing. It described Dorothy's mother helping with the work before her health failed in the early 60s. And then it detailed 1962, the year everything changed. Vernon Clark, partner, distributor, friend, until greed transformed him into something else, until threats turned into violence, until Donald had been forced to make a choice between continued production and protecting his family. The letter didn't provide details of what happened that night, only said, "I did what I had to do. After that, I shut everything down, sealed the vault, poured concrete over the hatch, and never touched it again." Dorothy turned the page. Her father's handwriting grew tighter, more controlled. "A man who shows the world everything he has is a man who's already lost it. So I showed the world nothing. I lived on what the farm made. I drove the same truck for 20 years. I wore the same boots until they fell apart. And I kept this secret buried, waiting for the one person I trusted enough to find it. The letter detailed the irrevocable trust he'd established in 1981, the legal protections that ensured nobody could take the farm from her, not Stephen, not her children, not anyone. It explained that the bottles were worth real money more than the house or the insurance business or any bank account, but came with a warning: don't let anyone take it from you. The people who love your money are never the people who love you. Trust the ones who show up when you have nothing. Dorothy lowered the letter. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere around the second page, replaced by something calmer, something that felt like recognition. She looked around the vault at the thousands of bottles her father had sealed, and stored at the engineering marvel he'd created underground, at the lifetime of protection and planning he'd invested in giving her this moment. "My father wasn't a farmer," she said to Gary. "He was an engineer who built a $20 million insurance policy for a daughter he knew would need it someday." Gary nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" Dorothy pulled out her notebook and opened to a fresh page. She wrote Strategy 1, Asset Verification 2, Legal Fortification 3, Market Optimization 4, Family Neutralization 5, Legacy Actualization. She looked up at Gary, and for the first time since Stephen's funeral, she felt something other than the mathematics of loss. She felt purpose. "I'm going to do what I do best," she said. "I'm going to solve the problem." Honsa. Dorothy didn't sleep the night she found the vault. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter spread flat beneath the overhead light, reading it until she'd memorized every word, every loop of his careful handwriting. By the time morning light crept through the windows, she'd filled 3 pages of her notebook with calculations and strategies breaking down the problem of converting a $20 million asset into liquid capital without alerting her children until she'd secured every legal protection available. The library in Hartsville opened at 9. Dorothy arrived at 8:45 and waited on the steps, her notebook tucked under her arm. The librarian who unlocked the door was a woman near Dorothy's age, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and an expression that suggested she rarely encountered patrons this eager. "You must be new in town?" "I am. Dorothy Walker. I'm living at the old Harris farm." The librarian's expression shifted to something warmer. "Donald's daughter. I heard someone had moved in. I'm Brenda Wright. Your father used to come in here every Wednesday to read the newspapers. Never checked out books, just read them here and left." Dorothy filed that information away, another piece of her father's careful compartmentalization. She spent 4 hours at the library's computer terminal researching vintage bourbon markets, estate law, and conservatorship proceedings in Tennessee. What she learned crystallized the strategy she'd been formulating since finding the vault. She needed expert authentication, legal fortification, and allies who understood what it meant to have family treat you as an asset rather than a person. Thursday evening, Brenda found Dorothy still at the computer and tapped her shoulder gently. "We're closing in 15 minutes, but if you're not busy, there's a quilting circle at the church tonight. 7 o'clock, you should come." Dorothy looked up from a legal document about irrevocable trusts. "I don't quilt." "Neither did half of us when we started, but we do now, and we talk about things that matter." The church basement smelled of coffee and fabric softener. 4 women sat around a quilting frame, their hands moving in practiced rhythms while they discussed property taxes and Medicare Part D premiums with the same attention to detail they applied to their stitching. Brenda made introductions. Martha Wilson, 67, whose son had convinced her to sign over her house deed while she was grieving her husband. Linda Scott, 58, who'd discovered her daughter had drained their joint bank account the same week Linda's car needed a new transmission. And Brenda herself, who'd let her son take her car 18 months ago because he'd insisted she was too old to drive safely. Dorothy sat in the fifth chair and listened. The stories varied in specifics, but followed the same pattern she'd experienced: adult children repositioning elderly parents as problems to be managed rather than people to be respected, financial abuse disguised as concern, theft rationalized as protection. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she worked her needle through fabric. My son took my house, put his name on the deed when I was barely out of the funeral home after Bill died, said it was for estate planning. Now he's selling it, and I'm living in a motel on Route 12 trying to figure out how to afford next week's rent. Dorothy set down the coffee cup Brenda had given her. What if we fought back together? The quilting paused. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Linda spoke first, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd already surrendered. Fight how I can't afford a lawyer. None of us can. What if I told you I found an attorney in Nashville who specializes in elder financial abuse? What if we pooled our cases and negotiated a bulk rate? Brenda's needle resumed its rhythm, but her attention stayed fixed on Dorothy. What resources? They took everything from us. That's the whole problem. Dorothy pulled out her notebook and opened to a fresh page. She wrote a number, $5,000. I'll front the retainer. You pay me back when you win your cases. If you don't win, you don't owe me anything. Martha's hands had stopped moving entirely. Why would you do that for people you just met? The answer came easier than Dorothy expected. Because fighting alone, we're victims. Fighting together, we're something else entirely. The following Tuesday, Dorothy drove Gary's borrowed truck to Nashville. The law office of Laura King occupied the 3rd floor of a building near Vanderbilt, the kind of professional space that suggested competence without the intimidation of excessive wealth. Laura herself was younger than Dorothy expected, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a handshake that conveyed both confidence and assessment. Dorothy presented 4 manila folders, each one containing a case summary she'd prepared with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to lesson plans: Martha's house deed transfer, Linda's bank account drainage, Brenda's car appropriation, and her own situation outlined in columns and footnotes that made the theft impossible to deny. Laura read through each folder without speaking. When she finished, she removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. These are textbook exploitation cases. The problem isn't winning. The problem is evidence. Most victims can't prove their mental competence at the time of the transfers, and adult children know how to create paper trails that look legitimate. Dorothy opened her briefcase, Stephen's old leather case she'd found in the guest room closet, and pulled out 4 additional binders. I documented everything: bank statements showing normal spending patterns before and after the transfers, property records, timeline analyses, comparative assessments proving competent financial management. Laura flipped through the first binder, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine surprise. This is forensic-level documentation. Where did you learn to do financial analysis like this? I taught mathematics for 35 years. This is just applied statistics. Mrs. Walker, most victims can't provide this level of proof. You've essentially done half my job already. Then you'll take the cases. Laura set the binders down and looked at Dorothy with an expression that suggested she was making a decision that went beyond simple legal representation. "I'll take all four. Pro bono for Martha. Her situation is the most urgent. Standard fees for the others payable after settlement." Dorothy pulled out her checkbook. "Why pro bono for Martha?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Laura answered. "Because 10 years ago, my mother tried to have me declared incompetent so she could control my inheritance from my father. I fought her in court and won. We haven't spoken since. When I see Martha's case, I see a chance to do it differently to help someone without destroying what's left of their family." Dorothy wrote a check for $5,000 and pushed it across the desk. "Retainer for the 3 paid cases. I'll cover Martha's costs separately if needed." Laura took the check, and something in her expression suggested this transaction meant more than simple business. "You're not what I expected when you called." "What did you expect? A victim who needed saving. Instead, I got a strategist who's already 3 moves ahead." Dorothy closed her briefcase with the same precision her father had used when building the vault. Some things ran in families, apparently. The ability to plan for contingencies nobody else could see. The email from Christopher Allen arrived 2 days later, responding to the photographs Dorothy had sent from the library computer. 3 bottles, carefully lit labels, visible wax seals intact. His response was brief and professional. If these were authentic, she was sitting on something significant. He could visit Tuesday of the following week, if that worked for her schedule. Dorothy typed her response with 2 fingers, the way she'd typed everything since the school district had finally forced teachers to submit grades electronically in 2008. She provided her address and added a postscript. She was 70 years old, living alone on an isolated property, and would require proper identification and references before allowing anyone into her home. She hadn't been born yesterday. Christopher's next email arrived within the hour, attached credentials from 3 auction houses, a copy of his appraiser's license, and a note that managed to be both respectful and slightly amused. He'd bring his portable authentication kit and enough documentation to satisfy the most cautious client he'd ever encountered. Tuesday morning, Dorothy woke early and cleaned the house with the same thoroughness she'd applied to her classroom before parent-teacher conferences. Gary arrived at 8 to help move furniture and ensure the barn was presentable for a professional assessment. By the time a silver Lexus pulled up the driveway at 10, Dorothy had coffee ready and her notebook open to a fresh page of questions. Christopher Allen emerged from his car carrying 2 aluminum cases and looking exactly like someone who spent his professional life evaluating things other people had underestimated. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, hands that moved with practiced care when he set down his equipment. He noticed the wedding ring tan line on his left hand before he did recent widower. Dorothy calculated probably within the past 2 years based on how the skin had faded, but not completely. The vault assessment took 3 hours. Christopher descended the ladder with his authentication kit and methodically examined bottles from each vintage year, testing wax seals, analyzing liquid clarity, cross-referencing labels against production records Dorothy's father had left in a ledger she'd found on the workbench. He took notes on a tablet, photographed labels, and spoke very little until he climbed back up into the barn and sat on the workbench stool with an expression Dorothy couldn't quite parse. This is the most well-preserved private collection I've seen in 30 years of doing this work. Your father understood barrel aging and storage conditions better than most commercial distilleries." Dorothy waited. Mathematics had taught her the value of silence after presenting a solution. "Conservative market estimate, 22 to 28 million, but only if we sell strategically." "Define strategically." Christopher pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet that suggested he'd been thinking about this question since receiving her email. "Vintage bourbon market is hot right now, but if you flood it, prices crash. Optimal strategy, 100 bottles every 6 months through vetted auction houses and private collectors, 10-year liquidation timeline to maximize return." Dorothy did the calculation instantly. "I'm 70. I don't have 10 years to wait for full value." "Then we front-load 500 bottles in the first year to establish provenance and generate operating capital. After that, we slow down and let scarcity drive prices higher." 500 bottles at what average price? $4,500 per bottle, conservatively. 2.25 million first-year revenue. Dorothy wrote the numbers in her notebook, her pencil moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades teaching children how to check their work. The equation balanced. More importantly, it provided enough immediate liquidity to fund the legal battles ahead while preserving long-term asset value. Christopher was watching her with an expression that suggested he'd expected more reaction to the multi-million-dollar figure he'd just quoted. "You're remarkably calm about this. My children took my house and my bank accounts 2 months ago. They left me with what they thought was worthless debt. Finding out it's actually worth 20 million is simply mathematics correcting their error." Something shifted in Christopher's expression, recognition perhaps, or respect. "I can start making calls this afternoon. I know 3 collectors who jump at authenticated pre-1960 bourbon. We could have contracts drafted within the week." They discussed logistics over coffee. Dorothy made too strong again, neither of them complaining. Authentication protocols, provenance documentation, market timing. The conversation was purely professional until Christopher mentioned his late wife in passing cancer 2 years ago. Sudden decline after initial positive prognosis, and Dorothy found herself talking about Stephen's heart attack, the coffee still warm in his cup when the paramedics arrived. "Do you ever feel guilty for moving forward?" Christopher asked, his hands wrapped around his mug. "Every single day." Then, "I remember Stephen spent 30 years building a business that our son is currently running into the ground while trying to steal what little I have left. Guilt is a luxury I can't afford right now." Christopher nodded slowly. "Your husband was lucky to have you. I was luckier. He gave me 53 years. My father gave me a vault full of bourbon and the legal protections to keep it. Between them, I have everything I need to solve this problem." "Oh, whoa." The first sale closed 3 weeks later. 40 bottles to a collector in Louisville for $160,000. Dorothy deposited the check at the Hartsville Community Bank and opened a new account in her name, only with Laura King listed as secondary contact for estate purposes. She used the money carefully, $11,000 for back property taxes, another $5,000 for current year assessment, $25,000 for house repairs that couldn't wait until spring, $12,000 for a used truck, because borrowing Gary's indefinitely wasn't sustainable. The farm began to transform in small increments. New roof shingles, repaired plumbing, a working water heater that didn't require lighting with a match and a prayer. Dorothy hired contractors from towns 20 miles away, People who wouldn't ask too many questions about where a 70-year-old woman living alone had found the money for renovations. Gary helped with the work he could manage himself: fence repairs, electrical updates, clearing the driveway of 2 decades' worth of accumulated vegetation. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side in comfortable silence, interrupted by occasional observations about weather or wood rot, or the way the barn looked almost dignified now that its roof no longer threatened to collapse entirely. "You're not planning to tell your children about any of this?" It wasn't a question. Dorothy hammered a nail into the porch railing she was rebuilding and considered her answer. "Kenneth needs money desperately enough that he filed legal documents trying to take control of my life. If he knew about the vault, he'd find a way to take it or destroy me trying. Rebecca might be different, but she chose her brother over me when it mattered. I'm not ready to trust either of them with information they could weaponize." Gary held the next board steady while Dorothy positioned it. "What happens when they find out anyway?" "Then I'll already have legal protections in place and enough liquid assets to outlast whatever fight they bring." The email correspondence with Christopher developed into something neither of them had planned. Daily messages about authentication and market conditions evolved to include observations about jazz versus opera, the ethics of selling versus preserving historical artifacts, the strange guilt that came with finding happiness after loss. They were both too old and too recently bereaved to call it romance, but companionship seemed accurate enough. Christopher's email one evening in late November: "Do you ever wonder if we're supposed to feel bad about not feeling bad anymore?" Dorothy's response: "Every day. Then I choose living over mourning, because staying in grief doesn't honor the dead, it just wastes the time we have left." Christopher: "You're wiser than most people I meet." Dorothy: "I'm older than most people you meet. Wisdom is just time plus attention to what actually matters." Rebecca's car appeared in the driveway on a Saturday in late November, the rental sedan looking absurdly urban against the backdrop of farm equipment and gravel. Dorothy saw it from the kitchen window and set down her coffee, calculating how long she'd expected this confrontation to take and whether she had time to finish the budget analysis she'd been working on for Laura's legal cases. Rebecca emerged wearing clothes meant for Nashville business meetings, not rural Tennessee heels that sank into gravel, a wool coat too light for the actual temperature. She picked her way up the path Dorothy had cleared, her expression cycling through surprise at the painted house, the new truck, the general appearance of competent habitation. Dorothy stepped onto the porch and waited. Mathematics had taught her that some equations required the other party to show their work first. "You painted it." Rebecca's voice carried the disbelief of someone confronting evidence that contradicted their assumptions. "Just the exterior. Gary's helping me work on the interior systems next month." "Who's Gary?" "A neighbor who knew my father. He's been generous with his time and equipment." Rebecca's eyes moved across the property, taking inventory of the cleared driveway, the repaired fencing, the truck that was old but functional. Dorothy could see her daughter doing the same calculations she'd probably done before driving here. Where did the money come from? How much was there? And most importantly, how could she access it? "Mom, where did you get the money for all this?" "I've managed. You had $52 when you left Kenneth's house." "This isn't managing. This is significant capital investment." Dorothy waited. Let Rebecca work for the information, make her ask the questions directly, instead of dancing around them with concern-shaped accusations. Rebecca climbed the porch steps, her heels clicking against wood. Dorothy had replaced herself with Gary's patient instruction. "This isn't safe. You're out here alone in the middle of nowhere with no support system. What if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or... I've been here for 2 months. I've repaired a house, paid off $11,000 in back taxes, bought a truck, and cleared 10 acres of overgrowth. If something happens, I'll handle it. I've been handling things my entire life, while everyone around me assumed I needed protection from my own competence." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed and without sound. Her carefully prepared arguments were equations designed for a different problem. An elderly woman who needed rescuing, not one who'd already rescued herself. "Kenneth's worried. Kenneth hasn't called me once. He's been busy with the agency. He's been busy trying to figure out where I got money he thinks should belong to him." Dorothy's voice stayed level, factual, stripped of the emotion that might give Rebecca leverage. "I know he hired a private investigator. I know the investigator filed a report showing I've deposited just under $500,000 over the past 8 weeks. I know Kenneth is facing bankruptcy because the business expansion he financed with borrowed money failed spectacularly." Rebecca's face went pale. "How do you know that?" "Because I taught mathematics for 35 years, which means I know how to research business filings and public records. Kenneth borrowed $400,000 in 2022 to open satellite offices. 3 of the 4 closed within 18 months. He currently owes $287,000 he can't pay. His monthly burn rate is $8,500. He has approximately 6 months before the bank forecloses. He needs help, Mom. He needs to manage his business better. What he doesn't need is to steal from his mother to cover his own poor decisions." Rebecca sat down on the porch steps, her expensive coat dragging against wood that probably cost less than the fabric. "I didn't know it was this bad." "You didn't ask. You just went along with whatever Kenneth suggested because asking questions might have required you to acknowledge what you were doing was wrong." The words hung in the cold November air between them. Dorothy didn't soften them with apology or emotional comfort. Some truths needed to be sharp enough to cut through the comfortable lies people told themselves. Rebecca's voice came out smaller than before. "What do you want from me? I want you to go home. I want you to think about whether you came here as my daughter or as Kenneth's intelligence gatherer. And when you've figured out the answer, you know where to find me." The rental car left 20 minutes later. Dorothy watched it disappear down the driveway and then returned to her budget analysis, calculating how much of Laura's legal work could be funded from the second whiskey sale Christopher had arranged for mid-December. Kenneth's response came faster than Dorothy anticipated. The conservatorship petition arrived via process server on December 15th, delivered by a bored-looking man in his 20s, who handed her the envelope and departed without ceremony. Dorothy read the document standing in her driveway, her hand steady despite the December cold. The petition claimed she was mentally incompetent due to her age and sudden relocation to an isolated rural property. It cited unexplained financial transactions and vulnerability to exploitation by unknown third parties. Kenneth and Rebecca were joint petitioners requesting the court appoint Kenneth as conservator of her person and estate, including all trust property. Dorothy carried the papers inside and spread them on the kitchen table. She pulled out her notebook and began a new section, Conservatorship Defense Strategy. The hearing was scheduled for January 23rd, 39 days. Dorothy spent them building a case that would make Kenneth's petition look exactly like what it was, a financially motivated attempt to gain control of assets that didn't belong to him. Week 1, Medical Documentation. Dorothy drove to Nashville and submitted to a full cognitive assessment at Vanderbilt Medical Center. Dr. Rachel Flores, a neurologist who'd specialized in geriatric cognitive function for 20 years, spent 3 hours putting Dorothy through tests designed to measure memory, reasoning, and decision-making capacity. When the results came back, Dr. Flores smiled for the first time since the assessment began. "Mrs. Walker, you test in the 95th percentile for your age group. Your cognitive function is exceptional. I'll provide a written statement to that effect." Dorothy collected 4 doctor's letters in total, each one documenting her excellent physical and mental health. She added them to the growing folder of evidence Laura was compiling, bank statements showing every transaction, categorized and explained receipts for all expenditures, appraisal reports from Christopher documenting the legitimate source of her income tax payment, confirmations proving financial responsibility. Week 2, Testimonial Preparation. Gary agreed to testify about her competent management of property repairs and farm operations. Tom Patterson from the hardware store would speak to her responsible purchasing decisions. Christopher Allen would explain the whiskey authentication and sales process, demonstrating that Dorothy's income came from legal, well-documented sources rather than the exploitation Kenneth's petition suggested. Week 3 brought the variable Dorothy hadn't anticipated. Nicole Walker's TikTok account posted a video at 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. The video showed a 16-year-old girl sitting at a piano in what appeared to be her bedroom, playing an original composition titled "The Farm They Forgot." The lyrics were simple and devastating. A grandmother abandoned by her children, left with nothing but debt, and a broken-down farm, while those same children fought over money she never had. The video went viral within 18 hours, 2.3 million views by Friday morning. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of elder abuse, expressing outrage at the unnamed family, demanding justice for the grandmother in the song. Someone identified Kenneth Walker within 24 hours of the video going viral. The business name was public record, easy to find once people started looking. Walker and Associates Insurance in Columbus, Ohio, run by a man whose own daughter was accusing him, without naming him directly, of abandoning his mother for financial gain. Dorothy's phone rang at 7 a.m. Saturday morning. Kenneth's voice came through tight and furious. "Tell Nicole to take down that video, now!" "Nicole doesn't take instructions from me. She's your daughter. She's making us look like villains." "You are villains. She's just documenting it with better music composition than I expected from a 16-year-old. This is destroying my business. I've had 3 clients cancel this week. The local news wants to interview me about elder financial abuse allegations." Dorothy poured her coffee with her free hand, the phone tucked against her shoulder. "Then perhaps you should have thought about public perception before filing legal documents accusing your mentally competent mother of incompetence. I'm going to win this conservatorship hearing." "No, Kenneth, you're not." He hung up. Dorothy set down her phone and watched through the kitchen window as Gary's truck pulled up the driveway, right on schedule for their Saturday morning work session. Some things remained constant, even when everything else was chaos. The hearing took place in a courtroom that smelled of floor polish and institutional anxiety. Dorothy arrived 30 minutes early, wearing the gray wool dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion, and carrying 3 banker's boxes containing documentation Laura had organized into categories that would make Kenneth's attorney work for every challenged assertion. Kenneth sat on the left side with his lawyer, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit who'd probably charged Kenneth money he didn't have for this representation. Rebecca sat beside her brother, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully arranged into concern that looked increasingly performative the longer Dorothy studied it. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and reading glasses that suggested she'd spent enough years on the bench to recognize desperation when it walked into her courtroom. She read Kenneth's petition, silently asked several procedural questions, and then turned her attention to Kenneth's attorney. "Counselor, you filed for conservatorship based on alleged mental incapacity. What evidence are you presenting?" Kenneth's attorney stood and delivered his opening argument with the kind of practiced confidence that came from believing his client's story without questioning the mathematics beneath it. Mrs. Walker was 70 years old, had abandoned her family home, relocated to an isolated, dilapidated property with no support system, and engaged in significant financial transactions whose sources remained unclear. The family believed she was being influenced or exploited by unknown parties and required protection through a conservatorship that would ensure proper management of her affairs. Laura King stood when the attorney finished, and Dorothy noticed the way Laura's hands stayed relaxed on the table. No nervous energy, just the calm of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment. "Your Honor, Mrs. Walker has prepared comprehensive documentation proving competent management of her affairs." The banker's boxes opened in sequence. Medical records from 4 physicians, cognitive assessment results showing 95th percentile performance, complete financial transaction history, every deposit sourced to documented whiskey sales through Christopher Allen Auctions, a licensed establishment with proper permits and tax compliance. Bank statements showing prudent management taxes, paid necessary repairs, funded no frivolous expenditures. Property records proving the farm was held in an irrevocable trust established by Donald Harris in 1981, making it legally protected from any conservatorship claim. Laura presented a timeline of every decision Dorothy had made since arriving at the farm, each one documented with supporting evidence of rational planning and successful execution. She called Christopher Allen as an expert witness to explain the whiskey collection's provenance and authentication process. She called Dr. Flores to testify about Dorothy's exceptional cognitive function. She called Gary Patterson to describe Dorothy's competent management of property repairs and farm operations. And then Laura did something that made Kenneth's attorney visibly uncomfortable. She presented Kenneth's own business filings, the public records showing Walker and Associates' financial distress, the loans Kenneth had taken, the offices that had failed the bankruptcy that loomed approximately 6 months in his future. "Your Honor, Mr. Walker has a clear financial motivation for seeking conservatorship. His business is failing. His mother recently came into significant legal income. This petition isn't about protecting Mrs. Walker, it's about accessing her assets to save his failing business." Kenneth's attorney tried to push back. "The source of funds remains unexplained." Laura didn't let him finish. "The source is documented. Mrs. Walker inherited 5,247 bottles of vintage bourbon from her father, who operated a legal distilling operation from 1949 to 1967. She's selling them through a licensed auction house. Every transaction is documented. Every dollar is taxed. There's no mystery here, just a son who can't accept that his mother doesn't need saving and won't be financing his poor business decisions. The judge looked at Kenneth over her reading glasses. "Mr. Walker, do you have medical testimony supporting your incompetency claim?" "No, Your Honor." "Psychiatric evaluation?" "No, Your Honor." "Evidence of actual cognitive impairment?" Kenneth's attorney answered for him. "No, Your Honor, but the circumstances suggest your client is facing bankruptcy and sees his mother's recent financial success as a potential solution to his own problems." The judge's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who'd watched too many families destroy themselves over money. "This petition is dismissed." She paused, removing her glasses entirely, now making direct eye contact with Kenneth. "Mr. Walker, I'm noting for the record that filing conservatorship petitions without medical evidence wastes this court's time and causes significant distress to the respondent. I strongly discourage you from filing again without substantially more compelling evidence." The gavel came down with a sound that felt like mathematics solving itself. Dorothy closed her banker's boxes and thanked Laura quietly. Kenneth's attorney was already packing his briefcase, probably calculating how to bill for this loss. Rebecca sat motionless in her chair, staring at nothing in particular. Dorothy made it to the hallway before Kenneth caught up with her. "This isn't over." His voice came out strangled, barely controlled. Dorothy stopped walking and turned to face her son. "Yes, Kenneth, it is. You've turned my daughter against me. You've humiliated me in court. I've done nothing except defend what's mine. You're the one who tried to steal from your mother. You're the one who filed false legal documents. You're the one who couldn't accept that I'm more capable of managing my life than you are of managing yours." Kenneth's face flushed red. "I'm losing everything Dad built." "Then you should have built it better." "I need help." Dorothy looked at her son and felt nothing but the cold clarity of mathematics. Some equations had solutions, some didn't. Kenneth's problems weren't hers to solve, and offering help now would only teach him that betrayal could be rewarded if he appeared desperate enough. "You need to face consequences. There's a difference." She walked toward the exit, leaving Kenneth standing in the courthouse hallway with his failures and his anger and the choice of what to do with both. Rebecca waited by the doors, her eyes red but dry. "Mom, I'm sorry." The words came out, rushed, desperate. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I took the car and the accounts. I am sorry I let Kenneth talk me into the conservatorship. I knew it was wrong. I knew it the whole time." Dorothy stopped, but didn't move closer to her daughter. "Why did you do it?" "Because Kenneth convinced me it was right. Because I'm drowning in debt from my divorce. Because I wanted to believe we were helping you instead of helping ourselves." "You weren't helping me. You were helping yourselves." Rebecca nodded, tears finally falling in a way that looked genuine for the first time Dorothy could remember. I know that now." They stood in the courthouse lobby while people moved around them, other families with their own legal dramas playing out in adjacent courtrooms. Dorothy studied her daughter and saw the same pattern she'd spent 35 years teaching students to recognize the moment when someone realized they'd approached a problem with the wrong formula entirely. "Can I come see you at the farm? Not for money, just to see you." Dorothy reached out and touched Rebecca's arm, a brief contact that conveyed more than any equation could quantify. "When you're ready to come as my daughter, not as someone looking for what I have, you know where I am." Laura found Dorothy in the parking lot, standing beside Gary's truck, in the January cold. That went exactly as we planned. Better. I expected it to take longer. Laura handed Dorothy a business card with a handwritten note on the back. I want to represent your quilting circle cases pro bono. All of them. Dorothy looked at the card, then at Laura. Why? Because watching you fight reminded me why I became a lawyer. And because my mother and I haven't spoken in 10 years. After I won my case against her, I felt victorious, but empty. I see your daughter struggling, and I don't want another family destroyed because winning felt more important than reconciliation. What are you suggesting? Let me mediate between you and Rebecca. Not Kenneth, he's too far gone. But Rebecca seems like she might be redeemable. Dorothy pocketed the business card. I'll think about it. The drive back to Hartsville took 90 minutes. Dorothy spent them reviewing the mathematics of the day, one conservatorship dismissed, one son confirmed as irredeemable, one daughter showing potential for redemption, one lawyer offering help that went beyond simple legal representation. The variables were shifting, the equation becoming clearer, and for the first time since Stephen's funeral, Dorothy felt like she was solving the right problem instead of just managing symptoms. Gary's truck pulled into the farm driveway as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the property Dorothy had reclaimed from neglect and her children's assumptions. She sat in the cab for a moment after shutting off the engine, looking at the house she'd painted the barn. She'd secured the land her father had protected with engineering precision and patient love. Some inheritances came in the form of money. Some came in the form of lessons. Donald Harris had given her both $20 million in bourbon and the understanding that the people who showed up when you had nothing were the only ones worth trusting with anything. Dorothy climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house where warm light spilled from windows she'd cleaned herself and a life she'd built without permission from anyone who'd tried to take it away. Spring arrived at the farm the way mathematical proofs resolved slowly at first, then all at once with an elegance that made the struggle seem inevitable in retrospect. Dorothy stood on the porch one April morning and watched crocuses push through soil that had been frozen solid 3 weeks earlier. The transformation reminded her of something her father had written in his letter, a postscript she'd read once and then filed away in her mind's catalog of unresolved variables. The coordinates on the watch hadn't been a combination, they'd been a location marker, but location markers implied destination, and Dorothy had already found the vault, which meant there was something else. She pulled out Donald's letter that evening and reread the final paragraph, the coordinates 35 degrees 47 minutes, 86 degrees 23 minutes, leads to something else. You'll need surveying equipment. I trust you'll figure it out when you're ready for what her father hadn't specified. But Dorothy had learned that Donald Harris communicated in layers, each one revealing itself only when you'd proven capable of understanding the previous level. The surveyor she hired came from Nashville, a professional named Mark Anderson, who arrived with equipment that cost more than Dorothy's truck and an attitude suggesting he'd seen enough unusual requests that nothing surprised him anymore. Dorothy showed him the coordinates and explained she needed to know what was at that specific location on her property. Mark spent 20 minutes with his GPS equipment walking Dorothy 200 feet northeast of the barn to a spot that looked identical to every other spot in that particular field. Grass, dirt, the occasional stone left behind by glaciers that had retreated before humans bothered naming Tennessee. You want me to do ground-penetrating radar. I want to know if there's anything unusual 8 to 10 feet below the surface. Mark assembled his GPR equipment without further questions, apparently deciding that a 70-year-old woman who could quote exact coordinates and depth ranges had earned the right to spend her money however she chose. The radar scan took 40 minutes, Mark moving in a grid pattern while studying the display screen with the focused attention of someone reading data instead of just collecting it. When he finished, he looked at Dorothy with an expression that had shifted from professional courtesy to genuine curiosity. "There's a void, about 8 feet down, rectangular, maybe 6 by 6 feet. Could be a buried septic tank, but the metal signature suggests steel construction, not concrete. Can you excavate it? That's a different crew and different equipment. But yes, you want me to arrange it?" Dorothy calculated the cost against her available funds from the second whiskey sale. "Arrange it." The excavation crew arrived 3 days later with a backhoe and the kind of casual efficiency that suggested digging holes for wealthy eccentrics was a regular Thursday afternoon activity. They worked carefully. Once Mark indicated the exact location, removing soil in measured increments, until the backhoe's bucket scraped against metal with a sound that carried across the field. 8 feet down, a steel box, 6 feet by 6 feet by 4 feet, welded shut, no visible lock or combination, just solid construction designed to withstand decades of soil pressure and water infiltration. Engraved text ran across the top panel in Donald's precise engineering script, "For Dorothy, open when you're ready to make the choice. D.H. 1995. 1995. 8 years before her father died, he'd buried this box, sealed this second cache, planned this second revelation while Dorothy was teaching mathematics to 7th graders and never questioning why her father spent so much time alone at a farm nobody visited. Gary arrived with a plasma torch and cut the welded seams, while Dorothy watched the metal separate like equations revealing their solutions. Inside the box, weatherproof bags contained items Donald had sealed with the same meticulous care he'd applied to every other aspect of this property. Item 1, metal case, containing $127,000 in cash, weatherproofed and dated 1995, Donald's emergency fund against contingencies he'd planned for but never needed. Item 2, geological survey report, professionally prepared, documenting rare earth mineral deposits beneath the property. Neodymium, specifically concentrated in formations the report estimated at extractable value of $4.8 million based on 1995 market prices. Item 3, mining permits, already filed with the state in Dorothy's name, dated 1995, legally executable whenever the property owner chose to authorize extraction. Item 4, a second letter from Donald. This one shorter than the first, its message distilled to essential variables. Dorothy sat on the ground beside the excavated hole and read while Gary stood at a respectful distance, giving her whatever privacy an open field could provide. The letter offered 3 options. Mine, the neodymium for maximum profit, $4.8 million over 5 years, but the land would be destroyed in the process. Sell the mineral rights to an eco-friendly company for approximately $2 million immediate payment while preserving the land's surface integrity. Or keep the land completely untouched, rejecting profit in favor of preservation, choosing pricelessness over price. Donald's final paragraph struck Dorothy with the force of a proof she'd been working toward without recognizing the theorem. I can't make this choice for you. I could only give you options. The mathematician in you will want to optimize profit. The daughter I raised will want to optimize legacy. Trust yourself. Dorothy folded the letter and looked across the property her father had engineered with such precision. The whiskey vault had given her financial security. This second cache gave her something else entirely, the choice between what was valuable and what was priceless, between equations that balanced in dollars and equations that balanced in meaning. She did the mathematics that night at her kitchen table, calculating with the same thoroughness she'd applied to every significant decision since finding the vault. Current assets, approximately $22 million in remaining whiskey inventory, $1.2 million in cash and investments, $200,000 in property value, and potentially $4.8 million in mineral rights if she chose to mine. Total potential assets, $28.2 million. Future needs $15 million for the foundation she was planning, $1 million for personal living expenses over the next 20 years, $2 million legacy for Nicole, $500,000 emergency fund, required $18.5 million, surplus even without mining the minerals, $4.9 million. Dorothy wrote her decision in her notebook with the same certainty she'd once written the solutions to calculus problems that had stumped her graduate school classmates. Choice preserve land. Some equations cannot be calculated in dollars. The Harris Walker Foundation opened its doors on a Tuesday in late May, operating from a renovated storefront on Hartsville's Main Street that had once housed a pharmacy and now contained legal aid offices, counseling spaces, and a reception area where people could walk in without appointments and speak to someone who understood that financial abuse often wore the mask of family concern. Dorothy funded the foundation with $15 million, the endowment structured to generate approximately $700,000 in annual operating expenses while preserving principal for perpetuity. The board consisted of 5 members, Dorothy as chair, Laura King as legal director, Brenda Wright as community liaison, Gary Patterson as operations manager, and Martha Wilson, whose house had been successfully recovered through Laura's legal work as client advocate. Nicole's TikTok series had reached 8 million cumulative views by the time the foundation opened. A record label in Nashville had contacted her with an offer that was simultaneously generous and exploitative, the kind of contract that looked impressive until you read the fine print about rights, retention, and revenue sharing. Nicole called Dorothy from school one afternoon, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone smart enough to recognize a trap, but young enough to wonder if she was being paranoid. They want to produce The Farm They Forgot as a full single. Professional recording, marketing budget, the whole thing. But I'd have to sign over creative control, and they'd own the master recording. Dorothy was in the foundation office reviewing case files when the call came. She set down her pen and gave Nicole her full attention. "What do you want?" "I want to do it, but I want the song to mean something beyond just me. I want the proceeds to go to your foundation." "Why?" "Because you showed me that fighting back is possible. I want other people to know that too." Dorothy felt something shift in her chest, a variable clicking into place with the satisfaction of a well-solved equation. Then negotiate a better contract. Tell them you'll only sign if you retain creative control, and if they agree to donate 50% of net proceeds to the Harris Walker Foundation for Elder Advocacy. If they say no, walk away. You're 16. You have time to wait for a better offer." Nicole was quiet for a moment. "You think I should walk away from this? I think you should know what you're worth and refuse anything less. That's not specific to record contracts. That's life." The contract negotiation took 6 weeks. The label agreed to creative control and foundation donations, though they negotiated down from 50% to 35% of net proceeds. Nicole signed on her 17th birthday. The single released 3 months later and went platinum within the year, generating $2.3 million for the foundation from a song about an abandoned grandmother that had started as a 16-year-old's angry TikTok post. The quilting circle cases resolved one by one through the summer and fall. Martha's house returned to her ownership through court order. Her son required to pay $45,000 in restitution for rental income he'd collected while she lived in a motel. Brenda got her car back, along with a court mandate that her son pay her insurance for 5 years. Linda recovered $78,000 from the joint account her daughter had drained, plus a 2-year restraining order prohibiting contact. Laura ran the legal clinic every Thursday evening at the church, the quilting circle transforming into something larger and more purposeful. 50 new cases filed in the foundation's first year, most of them following the same pattern: adult children repositioning elderly parents as assets to be managed rather than people to be respected. Dorothy attended the Thursday sessions when foundation business allowed sitting in the same chair where she'd first outlined her strategy for fighting back together. She'd learned that some problems couldn't be solved alone, that mathematics required collaboration when the variables became too complex for a single mind to track. Rebecca appeared at the farm on a Saturday morning in October, driving a sensible sedan instead of a rental, carrying an overnight bag instead of demands. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Dorothy with an expression that suggested she'd spent the past 6 months learning to recognize her own patterns. "Can I stay the weekend?" Dorothy was planting bulbs for next spring, her hands covered in soil, her back aching in the way backs did when you were 71 and insisted on doing your own garden work. "Why?" "Because I've been going to therapy twice a week since the hearing. Because my therapist says I need to face what I did to you instead of just apologizing from a distance. Because I want to understand how you did this." "Did what?" "Survived losing everything and built something better from nothing." Dorothy stood up slowly, her knees protesting the movement. "I didn't build from nothing. I built from what my father left me and what I'd always known I was capable of, but never had to prove until your brother forced the question." Rebecca set down her bag and stepped onto the porch. "I left him. Derek filed for divorce last month." Dorothy had suspected as much from the absence of a wedding ring and the subtle relaxation in Rebecca's shoulders, the way people looked when they'd finally stopped trying to satisfy someone else's impossible standards. Good. He was controlling, about money, about decisions, about everything. I think that's why I went along with Kenneth so easily. I was used to men telling me what to do with my life and my finances. You're 45 years old, Rebecca. Past time to tell yourself what to do. They spent the weekend working in the garden together, Rebecca learning to distinguish weeds from bulbs, while Dorothy explained spacing ratios and soil pH requirements with the same precision she'd once applied to teaching quadratic equations. On Sunday morning, Rebecca asked about starting an interior design business focused on historic property restoration, and Dorothy listened to her daughter outline a business plan that was actually competent for the first time in Rebecca's professional life. I want to specialize in helping people restore old properties without destroying their character. The farm could be my first showcase project. Not the whole thing, but maybe the barn. Turn it into an event space while preserving the structure. Dorothy considered the proposal. The barn's exterior could be renovated without touching the vault below. The space above could generate rental income while maintaining the property's visual integrity. The mathematics worked. More importantly, the symbolism worked. Rebecca, rebuilding something instead of taking something. Draw up a proposal. Include cost estimates, timeline, projected revenue. If the numbers balance, we'll discuss it. Rebecca moved into the farm part-time over the following months, keeping her Nashville apartment, but spending weekends and several weeknights working on the barn renovation. Heritage Restorations launched as a legitimate business by January, Rebecca's first client being Dorothy herself. The barn project documented and photographed for a portfolio that attracted 4 additional clients by March. The revenue from Heritage Restoration's first year totaled $85,000. Rebecca brought Dorothy a check for $5,000 at the end of the year, repayment of the legal retainer, plus interest calculated at 5% annually. Dorothy looked at the check and then at her daughter. "You didn't have to pay interest." "Yes, I did. It's called accountability, something I should have learned 30 years ago." Kenneth's bankruptcy filing became public record in March, exactly 6 months after the conservatorship hearing, his timeline matching Dorothy's earlier calculations with precision that would have been satisfying if it hadn't involved watching her son lose everything his father had built. Walker and Associates dissolved into liquidation. The satellite offices closed. The main Columbus location sold to a competitor for enough to partially satisfy creditors, but not enough to save Kenneth's financial future. Dorothy learned the details from Nicole, who called from college one evening, with her voice tight with the particular distress of watching a parent destroy themselves through poor decisions and pride. Kenneth had moved into a motel, the same kind of temporary housing Martha Wilson had occupied while fighting to recover her stolen property. The symmetry wasn't lost on Dorothy. "Aren't you going to help him?" Nicole's question hung in the air between them, filtered through cellular towers and the 200 miles separating Belmont University from Hartsville. Dorothy set down the foundation financial reports she'd been reviewing and gave the question the consideration it deserved. "What would you like me to do?" "I don't know. He's my father. He's a mess, but he's still my father." "Tell your father the foundation is hiring a business manager, $45,000 annually, responsible for accounting compliance, financial reporting. If he wants to apply, he can submit his resume like any other candidate." "You'd hire him after what he did?" "I'd give him the chance to earn his way back. There's a difference between rescue and redemption. I won't rescue him from consequences he created, but I'll offer him an opportunity to prove he's learned something from them." Kenneth's application arrived via email 2 weeks later, forwarded by Laura, with a note that read simply, "Your call." The resume was professionally formatted, but couldn't hide the gap where Walker and Associates had imploded. His cover letter was 3 paragraphs, the third one containing the only sentence that mattered. "I don't deserve this opportunity, but I'll work harder than anyone to earn it if given the chance." The foundation board interviewed Kenneth on a Tuesday morning in April. Dorothy abstained from both the interview and the vote, recognizing that her presence would skew the evaluation in ways that had nothing to do with Kenneth's actual qualifications. The vote was 3-2 in favor of hiring Laura, casting the deciding ballot with a justification that valued practical accounting skills over personal history. Kenneth started work the following Monday. He managed foundation finances with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd once applied to building his own business. The difference being that now he worked within structures someone else had established, instead of overextending on credit he couldn't sustain. Dorothy saw him at the monthly board meetings and passed him in the foundation offices, their interactions professional and distant. A relationship redefined by employment rather than family. They didn't reconcile. Reconciliation implied restoration of something that had existed before, and Dorothy had no interest in returning to a dynamic where Kenneth viewed her as someone who needed his protection or management. Instead, they coexisted in a new configuration, one where Kenneth earned $45,000 annually, managing accounts for a foundation his mother had created from assets he'd assumed were worthless. Year 2 of foundation operations, the board increased Kenneth's salary to $55,000 based on performance metrics that showed he'd implemented accounting systems that saved approximately $30,000 in annual audit costs. He didn't thank Dorothy. He just continued doing the work, which was the only thanks she required. Christopher Allen's dinner invitation arrived via email on a Wednesday evening in late spring, phrased with enough formality to maintain professional distance while making his intentions unmistakably personal. They'd been corresponding for 18 months, daily messages that had evolved from bourbon authentication to philosophical discussions about loss and meaning, and the strange guilt that accompanied finding happiness after grief. Dorothy read the invitation twice before responding. Dinner in Louisville, nice restaurant, not business, an actual date with a man she'd never met in person outside of professional whiskey appraisals. She was 72. He was 57. They lived 200 miles apart. The logistics were impractical at best. She typed her response, "One dinner. We'll see what happens from there." What happened was an evening that felt less like a first date and more like continuing a conversation they'd been having for a year and a half through email. Christopher met her at the restaurant wearing a suit that looked comfortable rather than impressive, his hands still carrying the careful precision she remembered from watching him examine bourbon bottles in her vault. They talked about music opera versus jazz, which led to a good-natured argument about whether structure or improvisation better captured the nature of beauty. They discussed his late wife's love of gardening and Stephen's habit of reading insurance contracts at breakfast. They debated the ethics of selling historical artifacts versus preserving them for future generations, a question that mattered more to people who spent their lives assigning value to things other people had made. Christopher drove her back to her hotel at 11, parked in the lot, and turned to face her with an expression suggesting he'd rehearsed this moment but was now improvising. "Would you consider doing this again monthly, maybe? Louisville 1 month, Hartsville the next. Nothing serious, just companionship." Dorothy looked at this man who'd helped her convert her father's whiskey into financial security without once suggesting she owed him anything beyond professional fees. "I'm not looking to get married again." "Neither am I. I'm looking for someone who understands that being alone and being lonely are different things, and that sometimes the solution to both is finding someone who doesn't need you to be anything except yourself." They settled into a rhythm, monthly dinners that alternated locations, occasional weekend visits when foundation business didn't require Dorothy's presence email correspondence that maintained the intellectual connection they'd established before the relationship became something neither of them could quite define, but both understood. Christopher attended the Foundation's first anniversary celebration. Dorothy flew to Louisville for an exhibition at a bourbon museum Christopher helped curate. They went to the opera in Nashville. They attended a jazz festival in Memphis. People who saw them together probably assumed they were married or heading that direction. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Two people who'd lost spouses they'd loved, who'd learned that love didn't follow a prescribed formula, who'd chosen companionship without the complications of cohabitation or the expectations of traditional romance. Christopher kept his house in Louisville. Dorothy kept her farm in Hartsville. They kept each other in the way people did when they'd survived enough loss to value presence without demanding permanence. Nicole graduated from Belmont in May with a degree in music business and contracts from 2 labels competing for her second album. She chose the smaller label with better terms and a philosophy that matched her own music as communication rather than commodity. The album released in September 12, songs about family and loss and redemption, The Farm They Forgot, anchored in the middle as the emotional centerpiece that had started everything. The album went platinum within 8 months, generating another $1.8 million for the foundation from royalties. Nicole continued donating. She visited the farm regularly between recording sessions and tour dates, usually arriving unannounced and staying in the upstairs bedroom Rebecca had renovated during her early work on the property. Dorothy found Nicole on the porch one evening in late fall, the young woman now 22, and carrying herself with confidence that came from understanding her own worth. Staring out at the barn with the same contemplative expression Dorothy recognized from her own mathematical problem-solving. The Foundation helped its 987th case today. Nicole's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who understood the significance of approaching symbolic milestones. 13 more, and we hit 1,000. Dorothy sat in the chair beside her granddaughter. Your songs funded probably 200 of those cases. Your whiskey funded all of them. My father's whiskey, I just sold it strategically. Nicole turned to look at her. Grandma, do you ever regret not mining the minerals? The question wasn't casual. Dorothy heard the weight beneath it, the real question Nicole was asking about choices and values and the difference between optimizing profit and optimizing meaning. Every time I look at untouched land instead of an open pit mine, I know I chose correctly. Money buys comfort. Land buys peace. I chose peace. Even though you could have had both, having both would have required destroying something I valued to gain something I didn't need. The mathematics only worked if I was calculating the wrong variables. Nicole was quiet for a long moment. I am going to inherit this farm someday. You are. What if I want to make a different choice than you did? Dorothy reached over and took her granddaughter's hand. Then you make it. The permits are in your name when the trust transfers. The choice will be yours. The only thing I ask is that you choose for the right reasons, because it aligns with who you are, not because it solves someone else's problems. 3 years after Dorothy found the vault, the Foundation reached its 1,000th case. An 81-year-old man in Memphis whose daughter had forged his signature on a reverse mortgage and was in the process of evicting him from a house he'd owned for 40 years. Laura took the case personally, drove to Memphis twice in 1 week, and had the daughter criminally charged within 10 days. The house returned to the man's ownership. The daughter faced fraud charges that would likely result in prison time. Dorothy organized a celebration at the farm. The whole Quilting Circle Foundation board staff and approximately 40 clients whose cases had been resolved successfully. Gary set up tables on the lawn. Rebecca coordinated catering from the diner in town. Nicole played piano on the porch, performing acoustic versions of songs from her albums. Dorothy stood in her kitchen at sunset and pulled a bottle from the cabinet where she'd stored it 3 years ago. Brennan Reserve, 1951 barrel, 1 bottle 1. The first bottle her father had ever made, the one she'd kept when everything else had been sold or was waiting to be sold. She carried it outside where Gary was setting up a makeshift bar. "Open this when I give the signal." The speech Dorothy gave wasn't long. She wasn't comfortable with public speaking, never had been preferred equations to rhetoric, but she stood on the porch with 100 people looking up at her and said what needed to be said. "My father built something in secret because he was afraid of losing it. I kept it secret for different reasons because I needed to protect it until I was strong enough to share it. This foundation exists because Donald Harris understood that the best way to protect your children is to give them options, and because all of you understood that fighting alone meant losing, but fighting together meant changing the rules entirely." Gary opened the bottle. The whiskey was 73 years old, Donald's first successful batch from 1951, the proof that his engineering precision could translate to distillation chemistry. They poured small amounts into glasses, enough for everyone to taste history. Dorothy raised her glass. "To the people who show up when you have nothing, everything else is just mathematics." The whiskey tasted like oak and thyme and the particular sweetness that came from patience and skill and a willingness to wait decades for a payoff you might never see yourself. Donald had sealed this bottle in 1951, probably never imagining his daughter would open it in 2026, surrounded by people he'd never met, celebrating a foundation built from the fortune he'd buried to protect her. Dorothy sipped slowly and thought about choice and legacy and the difference between equations that balanced in dollars and equations that balanced in meaning. She'd started with $52 and a farm everyone else considered worthless. She'd ended with a foundation that would outlive her, a granddaughter who understood that some things couldn't be calculated in currency, and a daughter who was slowly learning that rebuilding was harder than taking, but more valuable than either. Kenneth stood near the edge of the gathering, holding his glass, but not drinking, watching Dorothy with an expression she couldn't parse. Later, when most guests had left, he approached her where she sat on the porch steps. "I'm not going to apologize again. I know you don't want to hear it. I don't. But I want you to know I understand what I tried to take from you, and I understand what you built instead. And I understand that me understanding doesn't change anything between us." Dorothy looked at her son. "No, it doesn't. But it changes me. And maybe that's enough." He walked away before she could respond, climbing into his modest sedan and driving back to the apartment he rented in Nashville, $45,000 annually, and a chance at redemption he was still earning day by day. Dorothy sat on the porch as night settled over the farm. Rebecca was inside, cleaning up with Nicole's help, their voices carrying through open windows, along with laughter that sounded genuine. Gary had gone home an hour ago. Christopher would call before bed, like he always did when they were in separate cities. The Quilting Circle would meet Thursday, as always, new cases arriving every week from people who'd heard about the foundation that fought back against families who mistook love for ownership. In 5 years, Dorothy would be 78. The whiskey would be fully liquidated, the foundation endowment complete and self-sustaining. Nicole would inherit the farm, along with the choice Dorothy had made not to make the permits for mining minerals worth millions the option to destroy land for profit or preserve it for principle. Dorothy pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd started filling the day she found the vault, now containing 3 years of calculations and strategies and observations about the mathematics of family. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Some inheritances are measured in dollars, others are measured in options. The best ones are measured in the freedom to choose who you become instead of accepting who others need you to be." She closed the notebook and looked out at the barn where her father had engineered a vault that would save her life 2 decades after his death. The coordinates had led to whiskey. The whiskey had led to freedom. The freedom had led to purpose. And purpose, Dorothy had learned, was the only equation that mattered when you stopped optimizing for profit and started optimizing for meaning. The farm that everyone forgot had become the foundation everyone remembered. And Dorothy Walker, the 75-year-old mathematician who'd arrived with nothing, had proven what she'd always taught her students, that solving the right problem mattered more than solving problems quickly, and that sometimes the variables that seemed worthless contained all the value that would ever matter.